Now, I would like to invite our second guest and one of the main speakers for today's webinar. He is Professor Dr. Sami Al Arian, who is the Director of Center for Islam and Global Affairs, and also he is a Public Affairs Professor in the Sabahattin Zaim University, Istanbul, and he'll be talking on the topic, how the Palestinians face the current crisis. So I would like to invite Dr. Sami Al Arian to come forward and present his views.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for the invitation. I want to thank the organizers and the audience for being here today, speaking about this important topic. If the events that started on May 10th and for the next couple of weeks or so demonstrated anything, it has demonstrated the fact that today Palestine represents the struggle for justice around the world. It has become the symbol of all oppressed people around the world, those who have been aggressed upon, those who are struggling to regain and restore their rights. Israel today, it's always been, but today more than ever, a lot of people have discovered the nature of the Zionist state. When we talk about the struggle in Palestine, we really have to go back to the origin of the struggle. Otherwise, we will be lost in details. This struggle did not start a couple of weeks ago. It started over a century ago. And the reason we have a war today, the reason that we have this tension, the reason we have a conflict, the reason we have people being killed by the dozens and the hundreds and the thousands for the past 70 years is because of this origin. That is the Zionist state, the Zionist movement that started way back towards the end of the 19th century. When we look at the history of Jews, both in the Muslim world as well as in the Christian world, we'll find that there is a vast difference. Jewish encyclopedia call their presence within the Islamic communities throughout its history of 1300 years, the golden age of Jews, particularly in Andalusia. When we look, on the other hand, at the presence of the Jewish communities in Christendom, in the Christian world, we find that they were under tremendous pressure and persecution to the point that they had to suffer all the way, a lot of indignancies, all the way up until the pogroms and later on, of course, the Holocaust. The lesson that the Jewish presence in Europe taught them is that they need, in the re-emergence of the nation-state system back after Westphalia and its development, and right after the century of nationalism in the 19th century, is that they need to establish a national home. They need to establish a homeland. And they put their sights on Palestine, which was not empty. Palestine had its own inhabitants, it had its own history, rich history, its own heritage, and it was part and parcel of the Muslim world. It included Jerusalem, which is the third holiest place for Muslims around the world, where the Prophet has gone there in the night journey, where the prayers itself was prescribed during that night, where he led the Prophet. So it has a very, very sacred presence, not to mention, of course, that long history. My lineage, for instance, my grandfather was born in Jerusalem in 1892, but they take, of course, their heritage back centuries. On my mother's side, it goes even 1300 years, in the 7th century, when the first presence of the Arabs who followed the Prophet Muhammad went and conquest Jerusalem, and where Jerusalem became, of course, Islamic continuously, except for the few years that the Crusaders were in control, and it was another onslaught on Jerusalem, and it was liberated later on. Now, this Zionist movement came in the same way as other settler colonialist movements have become. It is not an indigenous movement for liberation. It brought its own purpose is to expel the indigenous people and replace them with a racial group, and that is because they redefined Judaism as an ethnicity, to replace them with Jews from around the world. That is the main purpose through settler colonialist project. Put it simply, that's what Israel is. It's a project. It's a settler colonialist project that has been led by the Zionist movement now for over a century. And its main purpose, as I said, is to bring Jews from around the world and to replace Palestinians, depopulate Palestine, expel the Palestinians, and bring Jews in their place. That happened, obviously, on a large, massive scale during the 1948 Nakba catastrophe, where over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homelands. My own family on both sides, from my parents, from my father's side, as well as from my mother's side, both were expelled from the city of Jaffa back in 1948, never allowed to go back again and restore their rights, their residences, their businesses, and so on and so forth. Another goal of the Zionists is not just to depopulate the areas that they take over, but also to expand their presence in Palestine. That is, they want to take over the whole land and expel as many of the Palestinians from these homelands so that they can be replaced by Jews. And that is the source of what happened back in Ramadan. There is a neighborhood, of course, if we go trace back also the history, they took about 78% of Palestine in 1948. It became 100% after the 1967 war, where the Palestinians were totally dominated by the presence of Israel through its military structure, through its intelligence services, through its police state, through a military regime. Palestinians have been living now, and I'm talking about the Palestinians in the 1967 areas, have been living under a military regime, under occupation. And people have to understand what that means. Military occupation. You are dominated in every aspect, every phase of your life. You have really no political rights. You have very little legal rights. Your economy is being controlled. Your life is being controlled. Your social structure is being controlled. Your residence is being controlled. Your water, your electricity, your education, every aspect of your life is being controlled by this regime, which is a military regime dominated by Israel, by its policies, as well as by its military. Another aspect of the Zionist movement is that not only they want to dominate, but they want to take as much of the land as possible. And of course, that's been done very, very slowly, gradually over the years. So today, before the 1993 Oslo Accords took place, there were only about 150,000 settlers, illegal settlers, according to the UN, according to all international norms. These are people who have taken over land and property that was occupied according to international law within the 1967 areas, including, of course, in East Jerusalem. Now, after the 1993 Oslo Accords, we have now almost 800,000, and that continues to grow year after year. They limit what the Palestinians can build on their own homeland. They try to make life miserable for them so that they can leave, and then they bring illegal settlers. These are not settlers, these are colonialists who are trying to take over Palestinians' lands and property. And in the neighborhood, one of the neighborhood in East Jerusalem, which is close to the Haram, close to the Masjid al-Aqsa, is a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah. And what they want to do, and what they have been trying to do, and they have done it in the past, they're trying to do it now, is to expel dozens of families, which count almost hundreds of people, by making fake illegal arguments. And of course, it goes to a racist judiciary that it's already been determined that eventually what they will do is to expel the Palestinians. They try every trick in the book to get it by trying to bribe the Palestinians, threaten the Palestinians, pressure the Palestinians, and when they don't give up, they just go and take it over and they throw them in the streets. And that's exactly what's happening. And in conjunction with this, there was another day they called Jerusalem Day. That's the day they entered Jerusalem back in 1967, where they have a parade every year by celebrating the fact that they have occupied Arab Jerusalem. And that this year, however, there were some extremist settlers that they wanted to go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque during the holiest month, after the holiest night of the month, which is after Laylatul Qadr, and take over the Haram by the thousands. And of course, the Palestinians were determined not to let that happen, and they started demonstrating, they started objecting to this, and in an effort for the Israelis to say that we are the dominant, we are the sovereign, we are the people in control, they kept pressuring the Palestinians, attacking the Palestinians, the worshippers during the nights of Ramadan. And it is reported that hundreds, perhaps as many as 600 or 700 people were injured during these raids. Now, the resistance in Gaza, those people who have been preparing to stand up to Jewish presence, illegal Jewish presence in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, as well as to the illegal apartheid system of Israel, is that they said, if you're going to do this, we are going to respond. We're not going just to simply accept your assertions that you're going to do this and take over our holy mosque, our sacred properties, and intimidate the Palestinians and kick them out and expel them. We're not going to take this. They give them one warning after the other. And of course, when they did not take it seriously, these things erupted. And for the first time, Israelis were under bombardment to the point where almost social and economic life was standstill. It just stopped. Airports were stopped. The economic production was stopped because they couldn't, this dome that they, the Iron Dome, they assert that it's going to stop all these rockets. Actually, they didn't stop much of them. And now they have to face more sophisticated rockets that basically after 10 days, they had to back off. That is the assertion. But before we go through this, in the few minutes I have left, I really want to discuss the long-term nature of what we're looking at, because there has been a lot of movement, political movement, that this is that there is a lack of political progress, that what we need here is a two-state solution. There is no two-state solution. Let's not kid ourselves thinking that there is somehow a magic political solution that is around the corner if the Palestinians were just compromising, if the Palestinians were just reasonable. The fact of the matter is that Palestinians have been given all the compromises, including the greatest compromise that came in '93, where the PLO leadership recognized Israel on 78% of Palestinian land. And then they were promised that within 5 years, they can be in control of the rest, the 22% in Gaza and the West Bank, and that they will have their own state. And yet today we are almost 28 years later with nothing in hand to show. In fact, all the possibilities of having a two-state solution is gone because of the presence of settlers and because of the determination of Israel in its Zionist form, that they have to take over the whole land and to depopulate Palestine as many of the people as possible. And if they do not adhere to Zionist dictates, then they must leave. That's the simple fact. And I think the world now is opening up, is waking up to the fact that this is what they're dealing with. They're dealing with a very aggressive colonialist settler project that is intent on imposing its own will on the rest by force. And the Palestinians, because they said no, and they're willing to resist and to stand up to aggression and oppression and repression and all kinds of pressures, then we are at a moment of clarity in this whole world, that if the world does not stand up with those who defend their rights on the side of justice against the side of evil, then obviously they have chosen sides and they must be held accountable. Now, if you look at the real solution, the road to peace and justice, it is, we cannot compromise with racial hierarchy in the same way that the world refused to compromise with apartheid South Africa. The world must today refuse and reject any kind of compromise with a system that prefers a certain racial group or ethnic group over the other. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing Jewish supremacy taking place in the land of Palestine, where you have today, if you are Jew, you haven't not ever set foot in the land of Palestine, you can just go there and get citizenship and get help from the government and get all the support you want. If you are a Palestinian whose ancestry goes back to generations and hundreds or thousands of years, you are denied all rights. That is wrong and must stop and must be rejected. And that's exactly what the world now that we're seeing before our own eyes. There are millions of people today who are waking up to the fact that this is what they are dealing with. They are dealing with an apartheid, colonialist, settler project, and they reject it. And therefore, the Palestinians, because they are fighting back, they are trying to get back their rights, to restore back justice, the right of return, the right to bring their properties and their presence, and not to be an afterthought, not to be a memory, not to be a heritage, not to be a period of history that has gone. They insist to go back, and that's what we're witnessing today. Now, the Zionist state, of course, is going to fight back. I mean, and to do that, they have certain tactics, and that's what they use. Obviously, it's what we see today in Israel is a garrison state. It's a military state that has been armed to the teeth, particularly by the United States. And of course, they always align themselves with other imperialist systems, imperial states, colonial states, whether it was Britain at one point or France in the 1950s, or whether it's the United States after 73, or after Nixon. The result is the same. You know, Israel cannot sustain itself without being aligned to other world powers who are in fact imperial and colonialist powers. They also want to align themselves to dictators and despots and minorities in this region, so that they can exploit these different tensions and different fault lines that exist in the region, so that they can dominate it. The major goal of the Zionist regime not only is to take over Palestine and depopulate its people, but also to take over the whole region by being the hegemon, by being the country in control. We see that, for instance, in its approach to the nuclear issue today. They want to be the only monopoly who have nuclear weapons in the whole region, and therefore they can dominate the region. So that's why they fight vehemently the fact that a country like Iran trying to get nuclear energy, any country that tries to get high-tech or nuclear energy, they will be fought vehemently by the United States in order to maintain its monopoly over the area. They also align themselves with other regimes who have similar ideologies, like the Hindutva, that what we see in India. Now the ruling party in India has been aligning itself with the United States because they have the same mentality in order to depopulate, or at least bring other people, let's say in the state of Kashmir. They're using Israeli tactics so that they can control the special status of Kashmir that has been a disputed, and of course Kashmir has been under occupation now for decades, in order to they can bring Kashmir to the fold of that country, regardless of what the indigenous population wish for. We can also see in this that not only they want to have hegemony over the entire region, but to weaken it, fragment it further. And we've seen many witnesses to this. We have seen it in the case of Sudan, how they've been a player into this. We have seen it in their attempt to break up, several areas, several regions, whether from the Kurdish part of Iraq or others. So it is very clear what their goal is. Let me conclude, because of the time, is that the goal of confronting an ideology that trying to maintain a racial hierarchy of one group over the other is to dismantle that state. We had that experience with apartheid South Africa. We could not have compromised with an apartheid regime. You cannot compromise with people who look down on others. What you need to do is to dismantle the institutions that bring this ideology into existence. After you dismantle this, then you talk about restoring justice to the victims of these institutions, and then we talk about peace. That's the only way we can bring peace. You bring peace by dealing with the roots of the problem. And the roots of the problem is that there is a movement that is trying to impose itself by force, by favoring a certain racial ethnic group over the other, by denying the rights of the other groups, the other ethnicities, and by imposing a whole regime on the whole region that will basically say we are the dominant, we are we are in control, we are the hegemon, and if you don't like it, you're going to have to either accept it or you're going to be basically aggressed upon. And if people say no and they resist, and that's what we are seeing, then they will certainly at one point defeat this regime in the same way that the people allied themselves around the world by building a worldwide movement in the 70s and 80s that brought down apartheid South Africa. What we need today is a worldwide movement, because the Palestinians themselves cannot deal with this menace, with this evil power, because of its support beyond simply the Middle East, because of its lifeline that's coming from many corners of the world. So what we need to do to have is a worldwide movement that will deal with this apartheid state in Palestine, that will bring it, that will weaken it, and eventually will bring it down and dismantle it. I'm not talking about, of course, all the rhetoric that they say, killing the Jews. In fact, Jews found security in the Muslim world. When they were kicked out and when they were facing either they have to become Christians or to have to die, they elected to go and immigrate into Muslim lands, all the way from Morocco to Indonesia, including, of course, here in Istanbul. And they call their presence within the Islamic world as being their golden age, because Muslims simply recognize Judaism as a heavenly, as a great religion, and therefore we have no problems with Jews. We have problem with Zionism. You can be a Zionist Jew, you can be a Zionist Christian, you can be a Zionist Muslim, you can be a Zionist Hindu, you can be a Zionist Buddhist, or you can be a Zionist with no religion at all. All of these would be enemies. But you can be also a person who is against Zionism of any faith, and you would be welcome into that struggle. And today what we need to do is a worldwide movement that will stand up to the apartheid regime in Palestine, and that will bring it down. And to do that, we have to confront them at all levels, in all geographies, and across all disciplines, diplomatically, politically, socially, economically, academically, culturally, human rights, media, you name it. Every aspect of that struggle we must engage in, because this is how we're going to bring it down, and this is how we're going to have this is how we're going to triumph, and this is how we're going to bring victory not only to the victims of Zionism inside Palestine and those who are in the diaspora, but for the whole world. Thank you very much.